Okay, so I'm Aron Pilhofer. I'm the editor of interactive news at the New York Times. My God, this room goes up high. This is a very weird, almost. Okay. Rosenthal asked me to come down, and this is my second time to this conference. Should be. No, it's good. Don't worry.
Okay.
We're all good.
Okay.
See? What did I tell you? Okay. So this is the second time I've been here, and my first time here was, what was it, 3 years ago? 4 years ago? It was a while ago. 3 years. And at that point, we had just sort of started this team that I run now at the New York Times, which I call Interactive News. The team is now grown to about 14 people. At the time, it was about 4. And what we do is a radical departure, I think, from, at least in my experience, what I used to do, which is straight up print reporting. Data is part of the reason why. The ubiquity of data, the availability of data, and the need to bring data and data journalism into the mainstream of newsrooms. So that's kind of the purpose of today's panel, is to look at the spectrum of how newsrooms are using data, how data is changing, the way we tell stories, and how the availability of data is providing new avenues for journalists to do different kind of work, and actually changing, I think, the very definition of who a journalist is, as will be evidenced by my co-panelists who will be up here in a moment. So when we talk about data, we kind of think of this, right? Spreadsheet, columns, rows. How many of you just went to sleep? Probably a very large portion. I will admit to you that you are probably not like me. I see columns and rows like this, and the hair in my arms stand up. I couldn't get more excited by this. But I will admit, I am not like you or most normal people. But let's think a little more broadly, though. I want to change how we think about data. I want you to take that spreadsheet right out of your brain and think about data like this. Paul Bradshaw, who's an academic in the UK, I think, to me, this is the absolute best definition of data out there. And basically, it's this. It is information that can be processed by computers, full stop. Full stop. Now, I'll give you some examples of how changing your thinking about data can impact journalism in a second. But this is my working definition of data for today. So you've seen things like this. This is our house map. This is from the wonderful work of our graphics team and my own team doing the data behind it. And this you can look at and say, all right, that's data. But what about this? How many people have seen this interactive graphic before? Now, if I had, yeah. I'm getting the from the audience. I don't have an internet connection here, but do yourself a favor and don't do this now, please, because there's sound involved. But Google this, fractions of a second, an Olympic medal. To my mind, this is the most amazing data-driven graphic I have ever seen. This is Amanda Cox, and I had nothing to do with this, by the way. I'm just a massive fan, borderline fanboy of her work. And to take the problem of telling a story driven by data, and turn it into something like this is truly amazing. But data can also be this. I don't know if my friend Alistair is going to talk about this or not, but everybody's tried to use other sorts of, we'll call it non-traditional forms of data. In this case, Twitter. Everybody's tried to do things with Twitter. Most of them stink. This does not stink. This is using the idea of a social network and bringing it into a news context and actually telling a story with it. And how did they do that? What they did is there was human intervention here. They got all these tweets around the London riots, and they wanted to study and answer one simple question: how did rumors propagate across social networks, and how were they corrected? And they had to do that in a very both complicated technically, but also very simple way. They asked the right questions. What are the rumors? Are animals actually being let out of the zoo? Are they running wild in the streets of London? And how did that propagate across Twitter? It's an amazing interactive. Data also can look like this. This is PolitiFact, started by Matt White and Bill Adair at the St. Pete Times. Here you're taking a very traditional form of journalism. This is basic watchdog reporting. This is fact-checking. and you're blowing it up, and you're rebuilding it into the web, into a web context, into a digital context, where every promise is a data point, and every promise kept is a data point. And you can then go through here as a reader and find out what has Obama kept, what has he not kept, and sort of keep track. This is an interesting approach. This also can be data. Politics Verbatim, this is a project started at California Watch, which is doing some incredible data work these days, particularly the project they did around earthquakes, which if you haven't seen it, you should look. This was an interesting approach because it takes something that is not structured data. In this case, what politicians are saying, this is the Jerry Brown-Meg Whitman race from a couple years ago, and where they're saying it. So it's taking what they're saying on one axis and putting it on a second axis where they're saying it. So what Jerry Brown says in Northern California about immigration versus Southern California. What Meg Whitman says, you get the idea, right? Interesting idea. And there's more of that. This can be data. This is the word train. This is a project we launched in 2008 at the Times. Gabe Dance, who's now at The Guardian, and myself worked on this. The idea here was to crowdsource, essentially, a news story. Anybody who's ever covered politics knows that the day of an election is probably the most news-free day of the election, right? Okay, a few of you laughed, and those are the political reporters out there, because you know on election day, there's absolutely nothing to report, right? The politicians show up, they kind of wave at the camera, they go into the voting booth, they wave at the camera again. That's it. That is what we have to report. But you also get this sense that there's this like kind of collective holding of breath, right? Because you know that as soon as those polls close, you're going to start getting some results, and then the news is going to happen. So Gabe wanted to capture that in a kind of an interesting way, and this was his idea. Just a simple question. What one word describes your mood right now? And then at every hour, we snapshotted it. And we asked you if are you a McCain supporter, Obama supporter, or neither. And as you can imagine, you can imagine how this worked. But it turned into a really interesting narrative. And as the readers sort of filled in the data points for us, you could see about, obviously 6, 8 o'clock, how these things diverged. And finally, I love this project. It's been an ongoing project of the LA Times for a very long time. It's the Neighborhood Project. I like this one in particular because the idea of a neighborhood is kind of a state of mind, right? It's not a defined thing per se. And they wanted to sort of capture that. They wanted to gather that data. So they sort of crowdsourced it. They said, hey, readers, here's what we think the neighborhoods around Los Angeles are. But you can take this map and you can adjust it and you can tell me where you think they are. And then they were able to overlap these differing boundaries and sort of figure out where people thought they lived versus where the so-called boundaries are. It's an interesting idea, interesting way to tell a story. So those are just some examples, and again, I just want to leave you with this idea that throughout this panel, that we need to sort of expand our minds a little bit about what we think of both as journalism, as data, and who journalists are. And so with that, I'm going to turn it over to Brian.